Hello, everybody.
Hello. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, Jason.
Hello, good sir Tom, and hello to everyone that is watching us live or many years later in the post-apocalyptic future that people will watch YouTube videos in. We are Jason Inman.
And Ashley Victoria Robinson.
And we are joined by the lovely Mr. Tom Merritt of the Daily Tech News Show and Sword and Laser. And Ashley, why are we here? What are we talking about?
Well, today we are talking about podcasting and tips from pros, because Jason and I consider ourselves pros, and Tom is pretty much the godfather of podcasting and Patreon. So we asked him to come and help us and help the audience talk about creating a community of geek goodness and sharing it to people all around the world. And this is a panel that we have been trying to do for a really long time. We bullied Tom into agreeing to do this at 2 different events, and Mainframe is finally giving us the stage to do it. So thank you to them as well for having us on.
Now, really quickly, just in case anybody is watching this panel and they're like, well, what do you guys know about podcasting? Mr. Merritt, would you like to shout out your bona fides and your expertise of where you get this expertise of podcasting?
Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody named Adam that probably doesn't want you to call me the godfather of podcasting, but I have been doing it for a long time. I started podcasting at CNET in 2005, March 2005, with a show called Buzz Out Loud that lasted for quite a long time. I went from Buzz Out Loud to doing a show called Tech News Today at the Twit Network, did that for several years, and then went out on my own. And I've been doing Daily Tech News Show for 6 years. And as you mentioned, I also do a science fiction and fantasy book club podcast called Sword and Laser. I do a cord cutting podcast called Cord Killers. We're just about to relaunch Current Geek, which is all about like deep dives into geeky topics. Oh yeah, thank you for that, by the way. I do East Meets West. I've been doing East Meets West since 2005, which is just kind of an old school let's just talk about anything podcast. So yeah, I've been doing podcasts for 15 years in lots of different settings, lots of different formats. So I've, at the very least, I've got longevity.
Yeah.
I do want to say, with all respect to the aforementioned Adam and to yourself, we all know that Conan O'Brien invented podcasting in 2019. Right, so we're just here giving our best advice.
That's right.
He's related in a long line of people who invented podcasting.
Yeah, really. And if anyone else doesn't know as well, Jason and I host the Geek History Lesson podcast with the amazing Mr. Jeremy Skinner has shouted out in the chat. We've been doing it for 6 years. We are almost at 350 episodes. And even though we look like babies next to Tom, we've been doing it for quite a while in the world of podcasting. So we wanted to chat kind of in 3 different stages about what it was like to create a podcast. So with all of our bona fides out of the way, if you're not impressed now, hold on. It's only going to get better. Let's start with, the basic question that everybody out there is asking, which is, how do you start a podcast? And I would love it if we could talk about how to focus your idea, because the seed of an idea is the most powerful thing. We can get to equipment, we can get to community building, all that's great. But where does the idea come from? How do we refine it?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, like you say, starting a podcast equipment-wise, service-wise is easier than ever. There's so many different ways to do it. You don't have to DIY it like you did back in the day. So it really is important to focus on having something to say. And I think what was true 10, 15 years ago is still true, which is you shouldn't do a podcast just because you want to be successful at podcasting. You need to be passionate about what you're going to talk about, right?
But I heard there's this mad Conan O'Brien money in podcasting, Tom.
Yes, if your name is Conan and O'Brien, possibly. Yeah. So yeah, I think you need to really have something you care about talking about, and that can be anything. And in fact, that's the beauty of podcasting, is even if your idea seems a little niche or a little narrow, that could be a very successful podcast. It may not get the Conan O'Brien level of numbers, but you don't need huge numbers to have a successful podcast. You just need people who really care about supporting what you're doing.
Yeah. For us, it was interesting when we started looking at creating Geek History Lesson. It went through a lot of different iterations. At first, we'd come up with this idea of sort of a debate podcast where, Ashley would pick one side of some sort of debate, and I'd say, so it'd be the idea of who do we think is the better lightsaber fighter? Is it Darth Vader? Is it Obi-Wan? And let's debate like the evidence to show that. And then we focused it around education because when we started in 2014, that was sort of the buildup or the lead up of like when YouTube and everything, like the learning aspect of YouTube is. And I still say that online, I think that is still like the most powerful aspect of the online marketing machine is how can you educate someone with your expertise that they don't have? And that's led us to literally Geek History Lesson, because I think I said, I was like, let's just call it exactly what it is. It's a geek history lesson. It makes the most sense,
And I think a lot of people get stuck on the name, but we got stuck on the name for a very long time. And then we actually followed in your grand tradition of calling the show what it is, which turns out to be very helpful.
Find a placeholder title and then stick with it for 6 years.
Yeah, basically. Like this is good enough. What led you to decide to do DTNS on your own after you'd sort of been working for these larger networks for a long time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the short version of the story is my wife had to move to Los Angeles for a job. I did the show for the network for a year from Los Angeles, but the network was up in Northern California, and they just didn't want me to do the show remote anymore. So I was kind of off on my own. I could have gone and joined another network, but I had done this enough that I'm like, well, I know how to make the content, right? And the tools, even 6 years ago, were pretty easy to be able to record and publish. And I had acquired all the equipment that I needed to do that well. So I said, why don't I just try this? And my advice to a lot of people in all kinds of content, but in podcasting as well, is if you have an idea, just start recording it, just start doing it. And see what people think and go from there, because it doesn't have to be this grand produced thing from the beginning. Not that that's a bad way to do stuff, but if you're just getting started, you're likely not to have as many ears on you. Now, I was certainly going to have more people interested in what I was doing, but I had been doing that kind of thing. So I just said, well, let me do what I do and see if that appeals to people, even if I'm not part of a wider network.
Now, Tom, I'd love to ask you, one of the questions, of course, when you're thinking about your podcast is what's the release schedule? We can now, a lot of podcasts, bigger podcasts, but back in the day, there were a lot of monthly podcasts. I think weekly is the standard, but even now there are daily podcasts. So for the 2020 sort of landscape we're in, what would you recommend? What do you feel?
I still feel weekly's probably your best bet.
I agree.
As someone who has done a daily show for 15 years, don't do daily.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, I think what you're trying to balance is your workload and return versus interest, right? And not that you can't do a successful monthly podcast, but it's harder to keep people interested. You're putting out fewer episodes. So if you are down the road trying to monetize it, you have fewer episodes to monetize, whereas weekly keeps people in the habit, keeps people coming back, keeps people interested and engaged. But it's not having so much in there that it's 5 times the work, which, a Monday through Friday podcast can be, or it's too much inventory for you to monetize. There are some advertisers out there who don't want to monetize a daily podcast because they feel like it's too much, and they want to shine on a weekly spotlight. And patrons sometimes feel the same way. Daily Tech News Show is a Patreon that you back monthly, because asking people to back per episode would just be too much when you have that many episodes.
We do the same thing for Geek History Lesson, and that is, I think for us it's an ongoing debate, and I'm sure for you it's an ongoing debate as well. Like, do you change that? How's the audience going to respond? And also, we come to Tom for a lot of Patreon advice. So
yeah, it's also the idea too, where we live in a world now where there's just so much content. There's more content than you could ever put out there. And I remember we used to be part of the Audio Boom Network, and they're one of the bigger podcast networks out there. They do a lot of like Blank Check and whatever. And I remember they once told us, they were like, do not do more than a weekly podcast, because we find through our analytics across every one of our shows that having the second show doesn't help you at all. Really, it doesn't help you in terms of subscribers or downloads or more listens. Like, you're just literally splitting the weekly listens across 2 episodes.
Yeah,
So.
and it, you know, if folks listening or watching are like, well, then why is this daily guy on here telling us to do a weekly? You know, there are formats like news, right? And the reason we do daily is because it's news, and we know that people are gonna, you know, want to have the latest version, and so being able to put something out daily. So there may be reasons to do it daily, and monthly may have, your content may dictate it, but by and large, I think most stuff, and most of the podcasts I do outside of Daily Tech News Show, are weekly.
I think you've hit on something really interesting, though, and you've mentioned it on a couple of the points. The question that you have to know, especially when you're coming right out the gate, is what is the goal of your podcast? You know, and you talked about like, oh, advertising, and like we'll keep joking about Conan O'Brien because it's just an easy shot to take. Everyone is subscribed to it.
Podcasts.
We get it,
right? Serial's all relieved now that all the energy is focused towards Conan.
Yeah.
But a lot of people start podcasts because they just want an excuse to chat with their friends every week, which is a totally admirable thing to do, a completely wonderful reason to start a show. But that is very different than if you're trying to create a platform, or if you're trying to create this as a stepping stone to something else. And I think they are all very valuable goals. I think the only reason, and I'm going to echo what Tom said earlier, to not start a podcast is to get rich quick, because it just won't happen.
Because neither will happen, rich or quick.
Yes.
There's a great question in the chat here from Rishi B, who said, what about seasonal? Which I think is a very important question here, because that has become the thing. A lot of podcasts like Serial, we mentioned before, have picked up this thing where they only put out 10 episodes once a year, 10 episodes sometimes 3 times a year. It's been a while since we've had a season of Serial. For me personally, and I'd love to hear both your thoughts on this. I kind of think that you can only do seasonal if you've got the name or the brand power to back it up, to keep people interested in your feed. Because I'm one of those people that when I'm done with a podcast or it is seasonal, I delete it out of my RSS app, whatever app I use. I don't park it in there. So when I hear, like, if you release a new episode a year later, I'm like, oh crap, and I got to re-download it and do that stuff. I'm not I don't sit on a person's feed waiting for that next season to come. Tom, what do you feel about a seasonal podcast?
Yeah, I've just started doing some seasonal podcasts. I think workflow wise, they're great because, again, you know, not having to meet that weekly grind means that you can focus more. I think they're very good for storytelling podcasts, for documentary style podcasts, single topic podcasts. So I just did one called Know a Little More that's seasonal because each episode is a single topic, and it gives me time to produce it. Current Geek Chronicles is going to be seasonal because we put a lot of effort into producing them. So it goes back to what kind of content are you doing and what does your audience expect? Because the way you keep someone like Jason from deleting that feed is to get them in the mindset of, oh, this isn't going to be gone for a long time. This wasn't, the season's over and I never know when it's coming back. You want to get people in the habit of knowing, like, oh, it's only going to be a month break while we create a whole new season of episodes. And so I'm not going to delete it because I know it's coming back. I think that's an important point that I hadn't really thought of till you mentioned that. Like, you really need to message.
I mean, I'm honestly, like, if perfect, like, a lot of podcasts, current ones out there, don't do what you just said. If I had those podcasts, if they ended their last episode and they're like, this is our season finale, we will be back in 3 months, I'd leave it in my feed. But most of them end, even big professional ones, like with a lot of money and a lot of brand power behind them.
Let's just say it's Serial.
Yeah. When is Serial coming back?
There you go, Conan. We're focused on Serial now.
Coming back. But I think that's the important thing about, like, setting a schedule and being very clear with your audience and clear with your expectations of both yourself, your workflow, and then your consumer, because I've done the same thing. Like, Serial is I'm not currently subscribed to it because I don't know when it's coming back. But something in that same vein, there's a CBC show called Uncover, and they do seasonal shows, and they let you know their shows begin every April. So every April, the new show's going to begin and then it will run its course. And dedicating yourself to the schedule that you've set, whether you're a crazy person and you're doing a daily show or you're a lazy person and you're doing a weekly show, that will help you retain your audience. And I think for people who might be watching who've had their podcast for maybe like a year or a year and a half and are looking to level up, that's when you can do sort of these macrocosmic things like community management or managing your audience, which is also something that Jason and I really look to Tom for, is how you involve your audience and how you maintain them in the future of your show once you figured out, this is the equipment I'm going to buy, this is the schedule I'm going to set, these are the kind of topics that I'm going to cover.
And I think that's a perfect way to talk about what are some tips for the first year of your podcast. Now, my first tip would be, and we were very stringent about this on our podcast, where the first year we did it, we set a weekly schedule and we said for the first year, we can't miss a single week. I want people to have 52 solid weeks that they know every Monday our podcast will be there in their feed. And we hit it for the first month. And I think over the course of our podcast, we've been pretty good. Like, we only take the most time we've ever took off from regular episodes is 2 weeks. And we even did a special episode where we're like, this is why we're taking 2 weeks off. This is where, don't go away. Please don't be like me and delete the podcast out of your app. But we're very clear, and we want people to be be dependable or understand our schedule. I think that's very important for your first year. Tom, what do you think is an important hint or tip for the first year of your podcast?
Yeah. It's changing all the time. So I'm going to tell you what I think works. But you kind of have to pay it. The first principle is pay attention to your community and your audience, even if it's small, and listen to them, because if what they're saying seems to contradict what any of us are saying, you might want to pay attention to that, because there's not a one size fits all. But what I do say, especially when you're starting from a small audience, is make those audience members stars of your show. Find an excuse or a way to read every email or posting that you get and thank people for it. It sounds kind of crazy, like, yeah, but I can't possibly include all the people. But when you're starting and you don't have that many people interacting, you absolutely can. And if you find a way to include them, and I say find a way because you may be like, this email's kind of crappy, but maybe you find a way to say, like, let me take one sentence out of it, or maybe just thank the person for writing in, like, hey, Pat, really appreciated getting your email. Thanks for that. Really, and write them back. Communicate with your audience. You have the bandwidth to make the community you do have feel especially part of your show in the early days. And you should take advantage of that advantage that you won't have later if your audience gets bigger.
Yeah. Now, another, I think, tip for your first year, and this would be something that is very applicable to our panel right now, is I assume a lot of people are making podcasts that have guests. And especially when you're starting out, every guest you bring in will be hopefully bigger and more famous than what you currently are. This was definitely something in our case, the first time that we sent an email to Tom. And my biggest piece of advice, and actually I would love to hear you chime in on this, because we, and I'm not trying to say we're as famous as the Mr. Famous Tom Merritt here, but we've been doing a podcast for 5 years now, and now 6 years, excuse me. Yes, don't want to throw off that last year. And now we get emails for people who are like asking us, and really quickly what podcast you want to do and what podcast you don't, and it's all based on how the email is written. And my biggest piece of advice to everybody out here is write a professional style email that doesn't make you seem like a crazy person, because you would be surprised at how many blank random emails you get. And you're just like, I think there's something wrong with this person that just emailed me. I don't know if I feel safe going on their podcast. Do you echo that as well?
Look, as a female, I'm very scared of everybody on the internet, just like blanket statement. You learn who's really nice. Like, we have a couple people here in the chat that are like longtime GHL listeners who we know are like real sweeties. Hi, Josh. And so when you have a relationship with somebody that you've managed, like Tom said, over the course of developing your podcast, that can make it a lot easier. I love it when people start their own shows and then ask us to be on it. Like that is truly like the coolest thing. And I'm like, oh, I'm like your podcast stepmom. Like that's the greatest. But we get a lot of blind solicits. And I would encourage people, if you're reaching out to someone with a bigger profile than you have to treat it like it's a business transaction. It's hard when you listen to a podcast because it is very personal and you're getting a lot of information about the person you're listening to, but we're all still strangers here. And I know there is the illusion that we're all buddies and there is a level of familiarity, but if we've never met in person, it's just like you're reaching out to somebody if it was a newspaper interview.
I would love to throw out a quick tip that I do to this day when I'm emailing people that I'm nervous about contacting or people that I really admire and respect. Everyone out there, I would highly recommend Googling how do you write a professional email that someone will read. I still do it to this day because I think that they change, like, oh, they're like, now we're finding that people open this type of email and this type of email. And if I'm reaching out to somebody that I've never emailed before, say who I really respect or admire or I'm a fan of, I will pick up those tips and I will make sure that my email has those or is professional or whatever tips they recommend. And it's a very easy resource to make your email better to where the person might actually respond.
I want to just add two things above all else. One, make sure that there's something in the email so that I believe or anyone believes that you know who they are. We've all been working on projects, especially crowdfunding projects where you've got your list of 50 people you want to hit and you really want to, and you're just copy pasting. Make sure you change the name or the opening or whatever it is that you're tweaking. Because I
can't tell you how many Dear Veronica emails I've gotten.
Oh yeah. Or here's a little secret. I'm the one who manages the Geek History Lesson email. And most people just go, thanks, Jason.
Yeah.
When I write back, and it's like, you got to sort of read the room.
The other one you get a lot is a lot of people will be like, Dear Victoria. And we're like, who's Victoria?
Yeah. And then the other thing that I think is very important, especially if you are inviting someone to come on your show, give them possible dates and give them possible times. It is your show. You are producing it. It's okay to say we tend to record on Thursdays around 6 p.m. Pacific time, but we can be flexible. That's great. But just saying anytime, you're putting a lot of pressure on your guest to become a producer of your show that they don't have any stake in. And then that will discourage people from interacting with you and reaching back out to you. And if you want to play in that person's, kiddie pool, you have to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah. And telling them how long you'll need them for is going to help too. Because if you only need them for an hour or less, they may be more likely to say, oh yeah, I can do that. Whereas if you don't say how long, they're going to assume it's kind of an open-ended thing. Like, oh, do I want to spend a lot of time?
Yeah. It's very easy, I think, especially for, very successful people to ignore an email than to write a reply back. And so you want to always make sure that the email you send is very easy to reply to. And I think that is the biggest advantage of getting a response back.
Yeah. I also think that once you've started the show, it's important that you make sure that there are things that you are willing to change to make the show fun and interesting for yourself, because you and your audience are the people who are going to have to keep listening and ultimately keep producing. So something that we did when we finally started to stray away from our typical lesson formats, we started doing lists. And that was like really fun and really interesting and a lot less work. So it balanced out our relationship with the research on the show. And now we do movie retrospectives, but everything that we've changed with the consent of our audience and as something that keeps us interested. And I also think that's something that you do really well, Tom, of bringing in like new segments or new ideas so that you're like, yeah, you've been listening to the show forever, but it's still fun and it's still evolving.
Well, I would love to throw that towards you because I know, again, you are in this upswell of upgrading Current Geek, which is a very long-running podcast. And what led you guys to be like, okay, we want to change this now, and why?
Yeah, it was Scott Johnson, my co-host on that show's idea. But what was funny is I had been thinking along the same lines because what we were coming across was there was a lot of work that went into preparing Current Geek, and there was a devoted following that enjoyed what we were doing, but it didn't feel to us like it was delivering what we were capable of. And I think both of us wanted a challenge that would take us off the grind of having to, in my case, research and post and write up 5 stories for us to talk about, having to bring in all these different segment ideas, and to say like, well, what if we went off live? So the first thing we did actually was we stopped doing the show live, which we had been doing forever. And that took a little bit of the pressure off. But then the second thing was Scott's idea of like, what if we just pre-produced it? What if we went the same topics that we cover, but we spent more time on them and we only did 1 per episode. And that led to us, looking at all these documentary shows out there that are successful, like the Radio Labs of the world, and saying, okay, well, what would our take on that format be? And suddenly we were creating this thing on our own with help. Like we were like, okay, well, we're going to need a writer, researcher. We're going to need a producer. And we put that all together. It's actually the opposite of the way I do Daily Tech News Show. Daily Tech News Show is done collaboratively with the audience, from as formally as taking surveys to just more informally in our Discord chat, finding out what people like. And we sort of, swerve and add segments and remove segments and change formats dynamically over time, which on a daily show, I think is essential, right? Because it can get, in a rut if you don't do that. So it's that constant line of communication. With Current Geek, we decided, okay, we know this might be a little scary to the audience, but we're going to over communicate. We're going to tell people like, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We think it's going to be better. We've built up a lot of trust. We hope we can cash in on that trust. Let us take a flyer on this. And they backed it on Kickstarter. They loved the first episode, and in a couple of weeks, we'll find out if they like the rest of the season. I hope they do.
Yeah.
As to I was going to say DTNS, which also, but as to Current Geek listeners, that's very, very exciting for us too. I also would love if we could chat really quickly about it. Because you've brought up Veronica and you've brought up Scott, my space dad from the Red Shirt Diaries. But Tom, you work with a plethora of co-hosts in addition to doing a lot of producing on your own. Jason,
so who do you dislike the most?
Who's the biggest jerk?
Obviously Veronica.
We all know it's Scott.
Yeah.
Sure, throw the woman under the bus. But I would love if we could chat just really briefly about like working with a co-host or working with a collaborator on a show. And
especially for you, because a lot of your collaborators don't
live with you.
They're in different states.
Yeah. I think only my producer Roger is in the same county as me. He's not even in the same city. And my co-host Sarah on Daily Tech News Show lives up in Northern California. She just moved. My co-host Veronica on Sword and Laser, who I threw under the bus because she's the nicest person I know.
Yeah.
She lives up in the Bay Area. A lot of my contributors and co-hosts live elsewhere. Scott Johnson's out in Utah. And the reason I like having collaborators is because it divides the work. First of all, you don't feel all the pressure on yourself, and it brings in other perspectives. It allows you to see some things that you don't get otherwise, and you can bounce off each other. And I think that makes for better content when it's not just your single perspective all the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you another question, Tom. You've been around this podcasting game, if we can call it a podcasting game, for longer than most. Not as long as Conan O'Brien, as we know. But what is a tip you would give out for how do you keep growing your show / audience? How do you keep that number going up instead of down?
Yeah, I don't know. Because I always feel like I've plateaued, even though
Tom, we want the magic key.
Please, yes. We're asking personally. Like, actually, we don't know if anybody's ever going to listen to this ever again. Like, Tom, we desperately need help.
There's so many different levers to pull, and they're always changing, right? Getting reviews on iTunes for the longest time, and still is a way to maybe get more visibility in the iTunes store, but it's kind of a black box.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it works the same way as it used to. One tried and true method, I think, is to get people on your show, get guests on your show so that their listeners are likely to come and say like, oh, I like that Jason Inman. What's that show that he's on, and go check that out. I think guesting on other shows and putting yourself out there as someone who's like, hey, you know what? I've got an idea. It fits into your content. Would you like me to be a guest? Again, all that stuff about being businesslike and respectful and understanding the show applies. But a lot of shows will appreciate that if you're adding contribution to their show, and then it exposes you to a whole new audience as well. The rest of it is just, hopefully hitting on the nerve of the people who like the kind of content that you're doing.
Yeah.
All right, let's ask the question that I know everybody thinks about because everyone's trying to get rich quick. when in a podcast life is it good to start thinking about sponsorship and monetization? And is Patreon the way to go as a blanket statement across the board?
Yeah, sure. I tend to say it's never really too early to think about it, but I wouldn't focus on it. You want to focus on your content. I'm a true believer in, if you do very good content, the rest becomes a lot easier. So I tend to spend most of my time on content. Monetization is not really something you're going to concern yourself until you get to a few thousand listeners where you can actually make any money off of advertising or even Patreon. The nice thing about a Patreon is it also is a community builder. So I would probably look to bring a Patreon into your show earlier as just a way to manage a community and make a membership and make a little club. There are other versions of Patreon out there, but for me, I haven't found any that give me the things that Patreon does. And there's a lot of,
I agree with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of complaints of like, but Patreon takes all this money. I'm like, yeah, but they also give you something for that.
They're doing it. They're providing a service.
I can't wait for when Tom moves over to OnlyFans. It's going to be incredible.
Wow. Right. Only mics.
Tomorrow.
It's the private podcaster section here. It's funny, Tom, I love that you hit on the idea of like spearheading that community, because for Geek History Lesson, we have found a lot of success in polls on our Patreon, because again, usually the people that sign up for your Patreon are the super fans of whatever you do. They're the ones that are willing to be like, I'm paying for this because I like you so much. And it's interesting because when we put up ideas up there, we've been proven wrong a couple of times, and I'm glad to have been proven wrong, where we're like, oh, they're all going to go for option A and they all vote for option C. And you're like, oh, I would have never considered that. So I'm glad that I was able to literally ask our audience that question. And that is a valuable tool that Patreon is giving it, I guess.
Yeah, you have to be careful because it's not scientific, but certainly when you get an overwhelming response like that, it's worth paying attention to. An early example with Daily Tech News Shows, we had a calendar segment where we talked about tech conferences and earnings reports and things coming up. And what was interesting is we asked people to berate the different segments, and there were segments that had a lot of people that hated them and a lot of people that loved them. The calendar segment had neither. People didn't care if it was gone.
They're ambivalent.
They weren't like, we got to get rid of it. And we're like, that's a segment that definitely needs to go, because no one is going to notice if it's gone, and it's not going to anger anyone if it's gone, because it's apparently something that's just inert, right? So we got rid of it.
Nice. So there's another question that I'd love to, as we wrap up this panel here, what do you think, Tom, are the advantages / disadvantages of joining a larger podcast network? Because, we have Earwolf,
Headgum,
Frog Pants is, I would consider in that, Headgum,
Maximum Fun.
Yeah, there's all kinds of these. And now even Spotify has become one of these things where Spotify is trying to wrap up a bunch of podcasts. Now, for anybody starting their podcast, I would not worry about Spotify till you're way down the road, or you have a celebrity like, say, Conan O'Brien on your podcast. But
never heard of it.
Yeah, who is this guy? Some new podcaster. Anyways, Tom, what do you think are the advantages of joining a larger network? Or let me ask you this, because you are sort of in this space as well. Is there an advantage to starting your own network?
Yeah, I would say don't start your own network unless you feel like all you can do is start your own network, right? Like that is a business. That is a whole separate thing. And if you're like, oh no, I want to do that, it sounds fun, I'm in a position, great. I don't think starting a network from scratch is the way to go. On the other hand, joining a network is something that you want to consider carefully, but has a lot of advantages. And I want to point out there's networks and there's platforms. I think joining a platform
good call
is a really good idea early on. There's Anchor, there's Acast. Sometimes the networks and the platforms overlap, like with Anchor, which is owned by Spotify. Platforms just give you tools, and it's a lot easier to pull yourself out of there if you need to. So platforms, I think, are a great idea to try out, especially when you're starting, because they make so many things easier. Networks, on the other hand, are going to take a lot of your choice away. And sometimes they take your rights away. So you have to be careful about that.
Yes.
You may be signing over, read things carefully. You may be signing over the intellectual property rights of your content, which you may be comfortable doing, but go into that eyes wide open. I would want to own my content as part of a network at this point.
Yes.
So that I can
Yes.
yeah. And but it's tempting to be like, well, I'm just getting started anyway. This is going to get me a wider audience. I think networks, sometimes people think, oh, if I join a network, suddenly the money will come pouring in. And that's not true. You still have to have listeners. You still have to be popular. You still have to have the ad sales. If you don't have ad sales, even on a highly listened podcast, you're not going to be making money, and the network's not going to find your show as valuable. So there's a lot of things to consider when you join a network. I would join a network if you don't like doing all the things that a network will take off your hands, and you aren't worried about creating a business for yourself out of the podcast itself. You want the kind of the halfway point between being employed by a big publisher, but being a DIYer and doing it all yourself.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, I would love to start with Miss Ashley Victoria Robinson here. And I would love for each of us to give, for podcasters out now, what do we think is the most important tip to remember for making a podcast? And Ashley, I'm putting you under the gun.
Ooh.
Do you have one, or do you need more time?
So the Harry Fairy answer to that is have fun, because the minute you stop having fun and enjoying the show and it becomes work, it's just like every other job. And it's not to say that those moments won't come, because they definitely do. But make sure that you are speaking about something that you are passionate about. It would be foolish for me to do a podcast about video games because I'm a very casual gamer. I'm very passionate about comics, so it makes more sense for me to talk about comics on Geek History Lesson. And then the other thing that I'm going to say to you is, do not underestimate audio quality. You do not have to be audiophile level good, but a couple simple investments and purchases that you can find all these lists. You can find them from Jason and I. You can find them from Tom. You can find them from a cursory Google search. Investing in some basic equipment and not just recording it into your phone will take you a long, long way. Those are like my basics. My
biggest tip I would give, and this is a tip that I see a lot of brand new podcasters do, even to this day, is I would highly recommend, and this leans into your fun.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend that the only editing you do on your podcast is for like inserting music bits or taking up things you flub. But if you are editing your podcast for every or weird pause, you are going to be spending 6 hours on every episode, and it's going to drive you mad. I had a friend who had a comic book podcast 3 or 4 years ago, and he started right about the same time we started Geek History Lesson. The podcast no longer exists, and it's because they would record an episode, and then he would go back and he would edit every single or awkward pause or anything. And it would take him like 5 or 6 hours.
But that's how human beings speak.
It is. And I think even if you listen to somebody big like Joe Rogan or people like that, they do not edit out the ums and uhs. And I actually think that makes the podcast seem more real, makes it seem more human. Now, again, if you flub up a name or you curse and you don't want curse words, that is totally fine editing. But otherwise, I think you should just let the conversation be. And save yourself a lot of editing time, especially if you're not. And I say this as a person who started as a film editor in LA. Save yourself that insanity. Tom, what big tip would you recommend?
Yeah, playing off that, I would say if you go live, it focuses you quite a bit. That's not for everyone, but I'll just throw that out there alongside your recommendation there, Jason. But along with the fun and keeping it fun, I would say also care and know about your topic. The maxim in writing is write what you know. And I think you could say podcast what you know. It doesn't mean you have to be an expert. It doesn't mean you have to know everything, but along with having fun and being passionate, you also should be experienced in the thing that you're talking about, right? If you are a big fan of jets, but you've never flown one, don't do a podcast about flying a jet. do a podcast about liking jets, right? Like focus your content on what it is you have to say, because you're going to have people correcting you. Sometimes they aren't correct.
Yeah.
And it feels better when you're like, no, I do know what I'm talking about. This comes from a place of authenticity. Like you were saying, Ashley, you don't want to do a video game podcast because, not so much with the video game. Same for me.
Maybe, Tom, we might know. No.
Look, if it's a Tetris podcast, I'm all over it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
She would murder that podcast.
Animal Crossing? Sure, I'm in.
Yeah. So right before we sign off, I would love to end off inspired by Jeremy Skinner's comment and question
in the chat there. Yeah.
If we could all mention a podcast that we are not on that is currently airing that we think is a great example of the stuff that we have been talking about, for the last few minutes.
Yeah, that is an example of a great podcast.
Jason, can I throw you under the bus to go?
Oh, this is very easy for me. This is a podcast I discovered about a year ago, and I think I got you onto it. Mm-hmm. There's a podcast called The Newsworthy. It comes out daily every weekday, and it's hosted by Erica Mandy. It's a 10-minute podcast where she just takes you through all of the not pop culture, but all the news events that have happened in the day. It's the sound quality is great. It's very clear. She is a person that worked in news before she left news to make this podcast. And she says it all in her title. She says, this is all the news you need to know, fast, fun, and friendly. And I think that is exactly what that podcast is. And I would highly recommend if anybody out there is looking for a quick and easy news podcast, I would recommend The Newsworthy with Erica Mandy.
There you go. I'm going to recommend, because I love murder podcasts, I'm going to recommend True Crime Garage, which is a podcast where they do a case or they do it over a series of episodes. So each week you get between 1 and 3 episodes, depending on the length of the case. But it is very highly edited, and they do fancy soundboard things like inserting police calls and inserting news reports. And so it is very much toward like the more professional, more polished end of the podcast spectrum, but they never veer off the focus too hard. And I really admire the amount of research they do, because I feel like we do a ton of research for Geek History Lesson that takes up a lot of time. And then when they go through a series, I'm like, dang, they do it so much better than I. So I always look at them as like a research-based show of what we should be striving toward. Tom?
Okay, so I'm going to make a lot of my friends mad here, but I'm going to disallow anyone who's ever been on Daily Tech News Show. Yeah. Otherwise, I'd be, I'd just be reeling off 30. So I'm going to say Reading Glasses with Mallory O'Mara and Bria Grant. It is a weekly discussion of the joy of reading. It's not genre focused, but they do both tend to like, Mallory likes horror and Bria does like sci-fi, but they talk about all kinds of books. They bring authors on to talk about both reading and writing. They're very pro-library. So lots of tips on how to get ebooks and audiobooks through your local library and all of that. So check that one out. It's called Reading Glasses.
That's awesome. All right. And I think that is it for this panel on podcasting. I want to thank everybody who watched. I want to thank Ashley. I want to thank Mr. Tom Merritt. And Mr. Tom Merritt, please let everybody out there watching now or watching in the far future where they can find you online. And please tell them about your podcast as well.
And
yeah, sure.
And your books, yeah.
Yeah. Well, TomMerritt.com, 2 R's, 2 T's, is the place where you can find all of my podcasts and the sci-fi that I write. That's all collected right there. As you mentioned, Daily Tech News Show. If you want to just 30 minutes a day, keep up on technology news, there's that. If you're like 30 minutes is too much, we have one called Daily Tech Headlines. That's only 5 minutes. So now you have no excuses. If you want to kind of have a sampling of everything I talk about with some special write-ups of articles, links to my writing Patreon where I do excerpts, freetomnewsletter.com gets you everything in your inbox once a week.
Nice. Ashley, please let everybody know where they can find you on social media.
Oh, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Ashley V Robinson. The V is very important. I don't want to fight the WNBA player for SEO, please. You can find Geek History Lesson at geekhistorylesson.com, or where all fine podcasts are had. I'm also on the Major Spoilers podcast, and I am doing the Mission Log podcast reviews for Lower Deck. So if you're a Trek person, find me there. Jason and I have a comic coming out in October called Jupiter Jet and the Forgotten Radio that we're going to talk about right after this. So just stick around and please pre-order that book from your local comic book shop.
Yeah.
Jason, where can they find you on there?
Well, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jawin. That's Jawin. It's the first two letters of all three of my names, Jason William Inman. And Ashley is right. We have a Jupiter Jet Spotlight panel at Mainframe Comic-Con right after this at 12:30 Pacific time. So just stay in this room and it'll pop up live and you can hear all about our great comic book and all those kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Since this panel was so great, I'm just going to say blindly to everybody out there that watched us, thank you. And make sure to subscribe to all of our podcasts. Just one here. It's like 17 if you subscribe with Tom. But they're all 17 great podcasts. This was a lot of fun. I hope you guys got some tips. Tom, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was a blast.
This was a blast. And thank you, everybody out there, for watching. That is our panel. Goodbye. We're now going to awkwardly wave until it cuts out.
But do stick around if you guys want more Ashley or Jason. You want to hear about their comic Jupiter Jet. That's happening in like 15 minutes. So don't go anywhere. We're just giving them a chance to use a restroom and get a drink of water because they've been talking so much. Thank you again for Tom. You guys can check out all these guys, all their podcasts, and we will be back in just a couple of minutes. So stick around.